Years after the horrific murder, a fingerprint exposed the killer. The Diane Maxwell Jackson case, Texas. There are murder cases that disappear into the darkness. And then there are cases that refuse to die. For 34 years, the murder of Diane Maxwell Jackson was one of them. The killer walked free. The evidence sat in storage. The fingerprints waited. And somewhere inside an old police file, a tiny impression left by a human hand was silently waiting for technology to catch up with a crime committed in 1969. December 14, 1969. Houston, Texas. It was a Sunday. Diane Maxwell Jackson was 25 years old, a young single mother, and a Southwestern Bell telephone operator. She had a job to report to, a routine shift, an ordinary morning that should have ended with her coming home. Instead, she drove into the company parking area and stepped out of her car. She had no idea someone was watching. The parking lot would become the beginning of a nightmare. According to investigators, Diane was confronted and forced from her vehicle. She was taken toward an abandoned shack near an old service station. Then she disappeared from view. Inside that structure, the attack became unimaginably violent. Diane was raped. She was strangled. She was stabbed. And eventually she was left dead. Her car was taken. The attacker vanished. And Houston police were left with a crime scene, a dead young mother, and almost no clear path to the person responsible. But there was something. Something investigators had managed to recover. A fingerprint. Not a name. Not a face. Not a confession. Just a fingerprint. A silent mark left behind on the outside of Diane's car. At the time it meant almost nothing. In 1969, fingerprint technology had limits that investigators today would find difficult to imagine. A print could be lifted, preserved, and compared against available records, but the enormous computerized systems that would later transform criminal investigations did not yet exist. There was no national database capable of searching millions upon millions of criminal records in minutes. There was no modern automated identification system, waiting to connect a forgotten print to a future suspect. There was only the evidence. And the evidence was filed away. The investigation continued. Police searched for answers. Witnesses were questioned. The circumstances surrounding Diane's disappearance and murder were examined. But no suspect emerged. No arrest came. No confession. No courtroom. The case slowly became what investigators call a cold case. And while the detectives moved on to other crimes, Diane's family was left with the unbearable reality that the person who had taken her life was still free. For her brother, David Maxwell, the case was never truly finished. He could not simply place his sister's murder in the past. The years moved forward. 1970. 1971. 1972. The country changed. Houston changed. Technology changed. People who had known Diane grew older. Her child grew older. The man who killed her grew older. And somewhere, the killer was living a life that did not belong to him. A life outside prison. A life without the consequences of what he had done. The fingerprint remained. Waiting. Waiting for the right machine. Waiting for the right database. Waiting for someone to ask the question again. Who does this belong to? Nearly 2 decades after the murder, David Maxwell decided he could not allow the case to remain buried. By then, his own life had taken an unexpected direction. The death of his sister had influenced him profoundly. He eventually joined law enforcement, first with the Texas State Highway Patrol and later becoming a Texas Ranger. He understood investigations. He understood evidence. And more importantly, he understood what it meant to have a family member whose killer had never been identified. In 1989, David began reviewing Diane's case. 30 years old evidence. Old reports. Old witness statements. Old photographs. Old fingerprints. The case was no longer fresh. The crime scene had long since vanished into history. But the evidence remained. David asked Houston police to take another look. The fingerprints were examined again. Investigators searched available databases. Nothing. No match. The print remained anonymous. The years continued. The killer remained unidentified. For Diane's family, there was still no answer. But then came a new era. The world of forensic investigation was changing rapidly. Computers were transforming police work. Fingerprint databases were becoming larger. Searches that once required painstaking manual comparison could now be performed electronically. And among the most important tools was the FBI's Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System, IAFIS, a massive national fingerprint and criminal history system. For a case that had been dormant for decades, this technology represented something that had never existed in 1969. A second chance. But first, investigators had to find the old evidence. And that was not as simple as it sounds. Decades had passed. Evidence had been stored. Files had been moved. Records had been handled by different investigators in different departments. The fingerprint evidence connected to Diane's murder had to be located and prepared for a new search. Then came a discovery that would later become one of the strangest details of the case. According to the FBI's account, the fingerprint evidence had been sitting in the system, but a previous search had not produced the answer investigators needed. The evidence existed. The killer's fingerprint was potentially identifiable. But the technology and databases available at the time had failed to connect the two. It was as though the answer had been locked inside a room, while investigators had been searching for the key outside. Then in 2003, the door finally began to open. On July 23, Texas Department of Public Safety latent print technician Jill Kincaid prepared the fingerprint evidence for a search through the FBI's IAFIS. The process began. The computer searched. 5 hours. That was all it took. 34 years of silence were about to collide with a name. The system returned 20 potential candidates. 20 names. 20 possibilities. 20 doors. But only one would matter. Kincaid examined the candidates. She compared the latent print recovered from Diane's car with the fingerprints in the database. One candidate stood out. The number one candidate was a man named James Ray Davis. And suddenly, the Diane Maxwell Jackson case was no longer a case without a suspect. There was a name. James Ray Davis. A man with a criminal history. A man whose past would make investigators look twice. Then 3 times. And what they discovered was chilling. Davis had been arrested for various crimes before and after Diane's murder. More importantly, investigators learned that he had just completed a prison sentence only 9 days before Diane was killed. 9 days. That detail changed the atmosphere around the investigation. For 34 years, Diane's killer had been an unknown figure. Now detectives had a candidate whose fingerprints appeared to match the print recovered from the victim's car. A candidate who had a criminal history. A candidate who had been released from prison only days before the murder. And a candidate who was still alive. Still somewhere in the world. Still reachable. Houston Police Sergeant James Ramsey became the lead investigator following the fingerprint identification. But there was a problem. A fingerprint found on the outside of a car did not automatically tell the entire story. The defense could argue that the man had touched the vehicle at another time. The print had been recovered from the outside of the car. Investigators needed more. They needed to know whether the man behind the fingerprint was the same man behind the brutal attack. And there was only one way to close that distance. They needed Davis to talk. Investigators located him living along the Texas-Arkansas border. 34 years after Diane's death, police finally knew where the man was. But knowing where he was and proving what he had done were two very different things. The investigators prepared. They had the fingerprint. They had the old photographs. They had the original evidence. They had the crime scene. And they had a name. For decades, the case had been a question. Now, for the first time, the question had a possible answer. The man who had walked away from Diane's car in 1969 had spent more than 3 decades believing the past was behind him. But the past had never disappeared. It had been waiting in a fingerprint. And now that fingerprint had found him. In Houston, an old murder file was being opened again. In Texas, investigators were preparing to confront a man who had spent 34 years beyond the reach of the case. And somewhere between a forgotten fingerprint, an aging photograph, and a crime scene frozen in time, the silence surrounding Diane Maxwell Jackson was finally beginning to break. The cold case was moving again. And this time it had a name. The name was James Ray Davis. For investigators, that name changed everything. For 34 years, Diane Maxwell Jackson had been remembered as a victim whose killer had disappeared into the unknown. Now the unknown had a face, a criminal record, a history, and most importantly, a fingerprint that appeared to connect him to the car Diane had been driving on the day she died. But investigators knew better than to rush. A cold case can survive for decades because one mistake can destroy the chance to finally bring it into court. The fingerprint was powerful. But a fingerprint was only the beginning. Detectives needed to reconstruct what happened in December 1969 and determine whether Davis could be placed near Diane at the critical moment. They began digging through the old case again. The original reports were decades old. Some of the people involved were gone. Memories had faded. Addresses had changed. Records had been archived. And yet the basic facts remained disturbingly clear. Diane had been 25 years old. She was a mother. She worked as a telephone operator. On December 14, 1969, she was going about what should have been an ordinary day. Instead, she encountered a man who would destroy her life and leave her family searching for answers for more than 3 decades. Now investigators were asking a question that had haunted the case from the beginning. Why Diane? Was she specifically targeted? Or had she simply crossed paths with the wrong man at the wrong moment? The answer remained buried. But the evidence surrounding James Ray Davis was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Davis had a criminal history. And his timeline was disturbing. He had recently completed a prison sentence. Only 9 days separated his release from the day Diane was murdered. 9 days. 34 years earlier, that detail had not pointed investigators toward a specific suspect. Now it was impossible to overlook. The fingerprint had brought Davis into the case. His history made investigators look harder. And the old evidence gave them something else. The crime had not happened in a vacuum. There had been a vehicle. There had been a location. There had been physical evidence. There had been a young woman who had vanished from an ordinary routine and ended up dead. And there had been a killer who believed he had left no trail that could ever reach him. But the trail had survived. It had survived in microscopic ridges pressed against a surface. The unique pattern of a human hand. A signature that could not be changed. A signature Davis had apparently left behind without realizing its significance. When investigators finally confronted him, the case entered its most dramatic stage. 34 years had passed. That amount of time can change a person. It can change the way they remember events. It can change what they believe they can get away with. And it can create the dangerous illusion that history has forgotten. But investigators had not forgotten. They brought the evidence to Davis. They questioned him about the murder. And eventually, according to investigators and court records, Davis confessed. The confession transformed the investigation. For decades, police had been trying to understand what happened to Diane. Now the man they believed responsible was acknowledging his role. But the story did not end with a confession. A confession in a 34-year-old murder case has to be examined carefully. Investigators needed to determine whether the details Davis provided were consistent with the physical evidence and the original investigation. They needed to separate what was already known from what only the killer could have known. This distinction mattered. A cold case confession can be challenged. A suspect can change his story. A memory can be questioned. But when a confession intersects with physical evidence that existed long before the suspect was questioned, the picture becomes much harder to dismiss. The fingerprint had been recovered decades earlier. The evidence had been preserved. The database had finally produced Davis as a possible match. And now Davis was admitting involvement. The pieces were beginning to fit. For Diane's family, however, none of this could undo what had happened. A fingerprint could identify a killer. Could not restore a daughter. Could not return a sister. It could not give a child the mother who had been taken away in 1969. That was the brutal contradiction at the center of the case. Justice had finally become possible. But justice arriving 34 years late is still 34 years late. While investigators worked, Diane's brother David Maxwell had spent years carrying the case with him. He had become a law enforcement officer. He had become a Texas Ranger. And he had never stopped looking at his sister's murder through the eyes of someone who understood both sides of the investigation. He knew what investigators needed. He knew what evidence could survive. He knew that a case could appear dead, while something important remained hidden inside it. And he also knew what it meant to tell a family that there was still no answer. For years there had been nothing to say. No suspect. No arrest. No trial. No final explanation. Only the same terrible fact. Diane was dead. Her killer was free. Then came the fingerprint. It was almost absurdly small compared with the enormity of the crime. A pattern no larger than a few centimeters. Lines. Ridges. Curves. Nothing that looked important to the human eye. Yet those ridges contained an identity. And 34 years later, technology was finally capable of reading it. The FBI's fingerprint system searched millions of records. Did not know Diane. It did not know her family. It did not know the years of frustration behind the investigation. It simply searched patterns. One ridge. Then another. Then another. Until the system produced a candidate. James Ray Davis. The machine had done in hours what investigators in 1969 could not do at all. But the technology did not solve the case by itself. Human investigators still had to follow the lead. They had to verify the identification. They had to locate Davis. They had to confront him. They had to build the case. And they had to bring the evidence into a courtroom. The fingerprint was the spark. The investigation was the fire. As detectives continued examining Davis's background, the timeline surrounding his release from prison became increasingly significant. He had not been some random person with no connection to crime. His previous criminal conduct placed him squarely within the kind of investigative history detectives would examine when trying to determine whether a fingerprint match could be connected to a violent offense. Still, investigators had to resist the temptation to let coincidence become proof. A criminal record does not make someone guilty of another crime. A fingerprint does not automatically explain why it was left somewhere. A confession must be evaluated. Every piece had to stand on its own. And then stand together. That is what made the Diane Maxwell Jackson investigation so compelling. The case was not solved because of one magical discovery. It was solved because evidence that had survived for decades was finally connected to modern technology, persistent investigators, and a suspect whose history placed him in the investigators' sights. The past had finally caught up with the present. In 2003, Davis was arrested in connection with Diane's murder. For the first time since 1969, her family could look at the investigation and know that the man accused of killing her was no longer beyond the reach of the law. But even then, one question remained. What exactly happened inside those final moments of Diane's life? The original investigation had described a brutal attack. She had been raped. She had been strangled. She had been stabbed. The violence was not accidental. Someone had made a series of choices. Someone had taken a young mother's life. Someone had then walked away. And for decades, that person had remained outside prison walls. Now he was facing the consequences. The case was moving toward court. The evidence was being prepared. The confession was part of the prosecution's case. And the fingerprint that had spent 34 years in silence had become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. There is something haunting about fingerprints in murder cases. They are left without intention. Person touches a door, a window, a vehicle, a glass, and the hand leaves behind something invisible to the person who made it. The killer moves on. The evidence does not. That was Diane's strange gift from the past. Not a photograph. Not a letter. Not a surviving eyewitness. A fingerprint. A fragment of identity accidentally abandoned at the scene. For decades it meant nothing. Then technology changed. And suddenly it meant everything. Davis's arrest sent the cold case into a new phase. The story that had remained buried since 1969 was now being told again. Old newspaper reports were revisited. Old investigators were remembered. The victim's family was once again forced to confront the details they had spent years trying to live with. And the public was confronted with a disturbing reality. A murderer could disappear for decades. A crime could grow cold. A case file could gather dust. But evidence does not necessarily grow old in the same way people do. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it survives. Sometimes the smallest piece of evidence becomes the loudest voice in the room. For Diane Maxwell Jackson, that voice was finally speaking. And it was saying one name. James Ray Davis. The question was no longer who had killed Diane. The question was whether the evidence would finally be enough to hold the killer accountable. 34 years after the murder, the answer was moving closer. The fingerprint had found its match. The suspect had been located. The confession had emerged. And now the courtroom was waiting. For the first time since that December morning in 1969, Diane's murder was no longer trapped in the past. It was coming back to life. Not as a mystery. Not yet as justice. But as a case. A case with evidence. A case with a suspect. A case with a confession. And a case that had survived 34 years of silence. The silence that had surrounded Diane Maxwell Jackson's murder for 34 years was finally broken. But a confession did not erase the questions that had accumulated across 3 decades. It only gave investigators a new way to examine them. Every detail from 1969 now had to be measured against what James Ray Davis had said, what the physical evidence showed, and what could still be proven after so much time had passed. For the people who had waited for answers, this was no longer simply an investigation. It was a reckoning. The case had begun on a December day in Houston when Diane left home and entered an ordinary routine that would end in unimaginable violence. She was 25 years old. She was a mother. She worked as a telephone operator. Her life was built around responsibilities that had nothing to do with crime, danger, or headlines. Yet by the end of that day, her name would become part of a homicide investigation. The scene was brutal. The evidence was limited. And the person responsible disappeared. For investigators in 1969, there was no way of knowing that the answer would eventually come from technology that had not even been created. They could only work with what they had. Witnesses, reports, physical evidence, fingerprints, and the car. That vehicle became one of the most important silent witnesses in the entire case. It had been touched by the killer. And although nobody knew it at the time, the vehicle carried a tiny piece of information capable of surviving longer than memories. A fingerprint. 34 years later, that fingerprint would become the bridge between a forgotten crime and a living suspect. But before the breakthrough, there had been years of frustration. Cold cases are measured not only by the passage of time, but by everything that disappears along the way. People move. People die. Buildings are demolished. Neighborhoods change. Records are transferred. Witnesses forget. Even investigators who once knew every detail of a case eventually retire. The physical world moves forward while the case remains frozen. Diane's murder was caught in that contradiction. The city continued to grow. Technology advanced. Generations changed. But the case remained tied to one day in 1969. For Diane's brother David Maxwell, that was impossible to accept. His sister was still dead. The killer was still unidentified. And somewhere behind that unanswered question was a family that had been forced to live with uncertainty. David's decision to revisit the case was therefore more than a professional exercise. It was personal. He understood that the passage of time was working against the investigation. But he also understood something else. Evidence does not always become useless simply because it becomes old. Sometimes old evidence becomes more valuable when new technology appears. That was exactly what happened. The fingerprint that had once been just another piece of evidence could now be searched through an enormous computerized database. The FBI's integrated automated fingerprint identification system had changed the possibilities of cold case investigations. A fingerprint could be digitized, could be searched. It could be compared against records from across the country. The search no longer depended entirely on a technician sitting at a desk with stacks of fingerprint cards. The machine could search. And in Diane's case, the machine produced a lead. James Ray Davis. The name was not merely another possibility. It was the beginning of a chain of evidence that investigators could follow. Davis's criminal history immediately drew attention. But investigators still needed to establish the connection between him and Diane's murder. The fact that someone had a criminal record did not prove that he had committed another crime. The fact that he had been released from prison 9 days before Diane's murder did not automatically prove that he was responsible. Investigators needed more. They had to ask the most basic question in criminal investigation. Could this man be connected to the scene? The fingerprint suggested yes. But how? When? And why? Those questions became increasingly important. The fingerprint had been recovered from Diane's car. That meant Davis had apparently touched the vehicle. But a fingerprint alone does not tell investigators exactly when it was deposited. It does not provide a timestamp. It does not say what the person was thinking. It does not reveal what happened moments before or after the contact. That limitation is precisely what makes old forensic evidence both powerful and frustrating. The fingerprint can identify a person. It cannot automatically tell the entire story. The investigators therefore needed to build the story around it. They returned to the circumstances of Diane's death. They examined the original evidence. They examined Davis's history. They examined the timeline. And eventually they confronted Davis. The confrontation became the moment that 34 years of uncertainty collided with the present. For the first time, investigators could place the suspect across from them and ask direct questions about Diane. What happened? Where were you? Did you know her? Why was your fingerprint on her car? The past was no longer an abstract file. It was sitting in an interrogation room, and the man who had once been an unidentified figure was now expected to answer. According to investigators, Davis confessed. That confession changed the nature of the case. The investigation was no longer dependent solely on a fingerprint match. The physical evidence and the suspect's own statements could now be examined together. The fingerprint said he had touched the vehicle. The confession connected him to the murder. The timeline placed him in the investigative picture. The old case was beginning to form a complete shape. But the emotional weight of the moment was impossible to ignore. For Diane's family, there was no celebration. There was relief. There was anger. There was grief. And perhaps most painfully, there was the realization that the answer had existed somewhere all along. The person responsible had not vanished into another dimension. He had continued living. The world had continued moving. And Diane's family had been forced to carry the consequences. 34 years. That is long enough for a child to become an adult. Long enough for a family to grow older. Long enough for memories to become photographs. Long enough for a city to transform. And yet the murder remained unresolved. Until the fingerprint spoke. The case also demonstrated one of the most unsettling truths about forensic evidence. A killer does not necessarily have to leave behind a dramatic clue. Sometimes the clue is microscopic. Sometimes it is almost invisible. Sometimes investigators do not recognize its value until decades later. The killer may believe that he has cleaned the scene. He may believe that he has removed the obvious evidence. But the human body leaves traces. Skin. Fibers. Blood. Fingerprints. Tiny fragments that can survive long after the people connected to them have changed. Davis had apparently left one of those traces behind. He had touched Diane's car. And he could not take that touch back. The fingerprint had survived him. By 2003, the technology existed to identify it. The investigation moved quickly once the match was established. The suspect was located. The arrest followed. And the case that had once seemed destined to remain unsolved suddenly became one of the most striking examples of a cold case being revived through forensic technology. But the legal process still had to begin. Davis faced the consequences of the murder. The prosecution had to present its case. The defense had an opportunity to challenge the evidence. And the court had to determine what could be proven. This is where the story leaves the world of detective work and enters the colder world of law. Evidence must meet standards. Claims must be tested. And the passage of 34 years creates complications that cannot simply be ignored. Witnesses may be unavailable. Memories may be unreliable. Documents may be incomplete. But physical evidence can sometimes bridge those gaps. That was the power of Diane's fingerprint. It did not remember. It did not change. It did not grow old. The rich pattern remained what it had always been. And the computer finally found the person behind it. For decades, investigators had been asking who killed Diane Maxwell Jackson. Now they knew. The man who had been hidden behind the darkness of an unsolved murder had become James Ray Davis. The mystery was collapsing. But the final chapter had not yet been written. There would be a courtroom. There would be a sentence. And there would be a family forced to hear the details of a crime that had haunted them since 1969. The passage of time had not erased Diane's murder. It had only delayed the moment when the evidence could speak clearly. And perhaps that is what makes the case so haunting. The killer did not leave behind some spectacular confession written on a wall. He left something far smaller. A touch. A fingerprint. A moment of carelessness. 34 years later, that moment became a name. The case had survived because the evidence survived. And now the investigators had to take that evidence into court and prove that the man identified by a decades-old fingerprint was not simply connected to a car. He was connected to a murder. A murder that had destroyed a young woman's life. A murder that had left a family waiting. A murder that had remained in the shadows for more than 3 decades. The courtroom doors were opening. And for the first time since December 1969, Diane Maxwell Jackson's name was about to be spoken not as the victim of an unsolved crime, but as the center of a case against the man accused of killing her. The fingerprint had done what memory could not. It had waited. And now it had brought the past back into the light. The past had finally caught up with James Ray Davis. For 34 years, the murder of Diane Maxwell Jackson had existed in a strange space between memory and evidence. The crime was real. The victim was real. The suffering of her family was real. But the person responsible had remained outside the reach of the law. Now that had changed. The fingerprint had produced a name. The investigation had produced a confession. And the case was moving toward the courtroom. For prosecutors, the passage of time created both a challenge and an opportunity. A case this old could not be presented like a recent homicide. There were no fresh crime scene photographs being taken. No newly discovered witness standing outside the police station. No suspect caught within hours of the killing. Everything had aged. Except the evidence. That was the strange power of the case. Diane's life had stopped in 1969. Her killer had continued living. The investigators who originally worked the case had grown older. Some were gone. The city had changed. But the fingerprint remained. A tiny record of contact preserved from the day Diane's car became part of the crime. The evidence did not know that 34 years had passed. Did not care. It simply waited. And now it had become central to the prosecution's case. The arrest of Davis reopened wounds that had never completely healed. For Diane's family, the news was both devastating and liberating. For years they had lived with a question that had no answer. Who killed Diane? Now they finally had a name. But knowing the name did not mean the pain disappeared. It meant the family had to face the story again. The details. The violence. The investigation. The evidence. And the knowledge that the man accused of killing Diane had been living for decades while she remained frozen at 25. That contrast was impossible to escape. 34 years earlier, Diane had left home expecting an ordinary day. Her family expected her to return. Instead, they received news that would permanently alter their lives. Now, in 2003, they were being forced to look backward. To December 1969. To the crime. To the woman they remembered. And to the man who investigators said had finally been identified by the smallest trace imaginable. A fingerprint. The case became a demonstration of how technology can transform an investigation that once seemed impossible. When Diane was killed, there was no nationwide computerized fingerprint system capable of instantly comparing a latent print against millions of records. Investigators had to rely on the technology of their time. If the suspect's prints were not in a searchable collection, the evidence could remain unidentified indefinitely. That was exactly what happened. The print existed. But the answer did not. Decades later, the answer was suddenly there. The FBI's office searched the print. 20 potential candidates appeared. One stood at the top. James Ray Davis. A name that had not been attached to Diane's murder for most of the 20th century. A name that now appeared at the center of the investigation. The FBI system had not solved the entire crime. It had opened the door. Investigators still had to walk through it. They had to verify the fingerprint. They had to investigate Davis's background. They had to locate him. And then they had to confront him. That process transformed a cold case into an active homicide investigation. The timeline became especially significant. Davis had been released from prison only 9 days before Diane was murdered. The number itself was almost impossible to ignore. 9 days. After years of searching for a connection, investigators suddenly had one. But they still needed to be cautious. Cold cases punish assumptions. Investigators know that a coincidence can look like a breakthrough until the evidence is examined closely. A criminal record does not prove guilt. A timeline does not prove guilt. Even a fingerprint must be interpreted within the context of the case. The investigators therefore continued. They built the case piece by piece. The old evidence. The fingerprint. The criminal history. The timeline. The location. And finally, Davis's own statements. According to the FBI, Davis confessed to the murder. That confession became another major element in the investigation. But the most striking part of the case remained the fingerprint. Because the fingerprint existed independently of the confession. It had been recovered before Davis became a suspect. It had been preserved before investigators knew his name. It had been waiting before the modern database existed. That distinction gave the evidence extraordinary significance. The suspect could deny. The suspect could change his story. The suspect could claim investigators misunderstood. But the fingerprint had no motive to lie. It was simply there. The legal system would now have to decide what all of those pieces meant when placed together. For the family, however, the legal arguments were secondary. They wanted accountability. They wanted the case to stop being described as unsolved. They wanted Diane's death to have an ending. For decades, the word cold had followed the case. Cold case. Cold file. Cold evidence. Cold trail. Now the case was alive again. The media began paying attention. The story carried all the elements of a crime that seemed almost impossible to solve. A young mother murdered in 1969. A killer who disappeared. A fingerprint left behind. 34 years of silence. Then a computer search. A name. An arrest. Confession. It was the kind of sequence that sounds like fiction. But the tragedy at its center was real. Diane was real. Her family was real. And the 34 years they spent waiting were real. The case also raised a haunting question about justice. How much time can pass before justice becomes impossible? 10 years? 20? 30? In Diane's case, it was 34. The answer did not arrive when the family needed it most. It arrived when Diane would have been 59 years old. When the world she knew had changed almost beyond recognition. When the man accused of killing her had become an older man himself. Time had transformed everyone except the victim. Her photograph remained. Her name remained. And the crime remained. The courtroom would now have to bring all of those years together. The prosecution's story was simple at its core. Diane was murdered. A fingerprint from her vehicle belonged to Davis. Davis had a criminal history. He had been released from prison only days before the murder. And after investigators confronted him, he confessed. Each fact was significant. Together they formed a chain. But the emotional power of the case came from something deeper. The chain had been waiting for 34 years. It had not been broken. It had simply been incomplete. The final connection came through technology. A computer had searched a fingerprint that human investigators had been unable to identify decades earlier. That search had produced a list. And from that list came the man who had been invisible to the case for most of his life. This was not the dramatic discovery of a weapon buried in the ground. It was not a secret diary. It was not a mysterious letter. It was a fingerprint. Something so ordinary that most people would never notice it. Yet fingerprints are unique. And the one left behind on Diane's car became a permanent connection between a suspect and a crime scene. By late 2003, the case was approaching its final stage. James Ray Davis was no longer an unknown man somewhere beyond the investigation. He was in custody. The decades of uncertainty were ending. For Diane's brother, David Maxwell, the moment carried a painful meaning. He had spent years working in law enforcement while carrying the memory of his sister's murder. He had seen countless cases. He knew how investigations worked. He knew how difficult it was to revive evidence from decades earlier. And he knew that sometimes the difference between an unsolved murder and a solved murder was nothing more than one person refusing to let the case disappear. That persistence mattered. Without it, the old fingerprint might have remained forgotten. Without the technology, the fingerprint might have remained unidentified. Without investigators following the lead, the name James Ray Davis might never have been connected to Diane. Took all three. Persistence, technology, evidence. And then came the final question. What would the court do with a 34-year-old murder? The answer arrived on November 24, 2003. James Ray Davis pleaded guilty to murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. The case that had remained unresolved since 1969 had finally reached its legal conclusion. 34 years after Diane Maxwell Jackson was killed, her family finally knew who was responsible. The man who had escaped justice for decades would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But there was no way to return the years that had been lost. There was no way to give Diane back to her family. There was no way to erase the violence of that December day. A sentence can punish a killer, cannot reverse a murder. That is the truth at the center of every cold case. Justice may arrive, but it never arrives with the power to change the past. For Diane, the past remained fixed. 25 years old. A young mother. A telephone operator. A woman whose ordinary day ended in violence. For her family, however, the future finally contained something that had been missing for decades. An answer. The word unsolved could finally be removed from the case. The killer had a name. The evidence had spoken. The courtroom had delivered its sentence. And the fingerprint that once seemed insignificant had become the thread that connected 1969 to 2003. But even after the conviction, one image remained impossible to forget. A single fingerprint. Left behind on a car. Waiting 34 years. It had no voice. No memory. No emotion. Yet it survived every failed search. Every passing year. Every unanswered question. Until technology finally gave it a voice. And when that voice was heard, it did not tell investigators a story. It gave them a name. James Ray Davis. That name ended 34 years of uncertainty. But it could never end Diane's story. Because Diane was more than a cold case. She was a daughter. A sister. A mother. A woman whose life was reduced to a crime scene in December 1969. And for 34 years the world knew the crime but not the killer. Then one fingerprint changed everything. Not because the fingerprint was dramatic. Not because it was discovered yesterday. But because it had been there all along. Waiting for the future to become capable of understanding the past. The courtroom could deliver a sentence, but it could not turn back time. On November 24, 2003, James Ray Davis pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to life in prison. After 34 years, the legal chapter of Diane Maxwell Jackson's case had finally reached its conclusion. But for the people who had loved Diane, there was another reality. A conviction does not erase a murder. It does not erase the phone call that changed a family's life. It does not erase the image of a young woman who should have grown older, raised her child, watched another birthday arrive, and lived through decades that were taken from her in a single violent encounter. Justice had arrived. But it had arrived late. Very late. And that delay became part of the story itself. Diane had been 25 when she was killed. By the time her killer was identified, she would have been nearly 60. 34 years separated those two moments. A generation had passed. The world had changed. The technology that eventually identified Davis did not exist when Diane was murdered. That fact is important because it explains why the case remained dormant for so long. Investigators in 1969 were not careless simply because they could not solve it. They were working in a different era. A fingerprint could be recovered, could be preserved. But finding its owner was another matter entirely. Without a searchable national computerized database, investigators had to depend on the records available to them and on traditional investigative techniques. If the person behind the print was not already known to authorities under circumstances that made his fingerprints accessible, the evidence could remain unidentified. That is exactly what happened. The fingerprint became a time capsule. It contained the identity of a man who had not yet been named in the case. But the technology required to unlock that identity had not arrived. So the evidence waited. This is what makes the Diane Maxwell Jackson case so haunting. The breakthrough did not begin with a brand new clue. It began with an old clue. Something investigators had possessed for years. The difference was not the evidence. The difference was the ability to search it. When Jill Kincaid prepared the latent fingerprint for a search through the FBI's IAFI system in 2003, the process represented a dramatic shift from the methods available decades earlier. The computer searched. 5 hours later, the system returned 20 potential candidates. Among them was James Ray Davis. The name changed the entire direction of the investigation. But the computer did not know that Diane was a mother. It did not know that she was 25. It did not know that her family had waited more than 3 decades. It did not know the violence surrounding her death. It simply recognized a pattern. The ridges matched. The pattern pointed toward a person. And investigators followed. That is the strange intersection of human tragedy and forensic science. A machine can identify a fingerprint. Only people can understand what that identification means. For investigators, the result meant a suspect. For Diane's family, it meant the possibility of an answer. For Davis, it meant the past had finally returned. The passage of time had not erased his connection to the evidence. It had only delayed its discovery. And there was another detail that made the identification especially significant. Davis had been released from prison only 9 days before Diane was murdered. The timeline was striking. 9 days after completing a prison sentence, a man whose fingerprint would eventually be found on Diane's car became the focus of a homicide investigation. For detectives, that did not constitute proof by itself. But it was another piece of the puzzle. The more investigators examined Davis, the more the old case began to take shape. A fingerprint. A criminal history. A disturbing timeline. And eventually a confession. The case that once contained unanswered questions now contained a sequence of evidence pointing toward the same man. Yet the story of Diane remained larger than the evidence. It is easy decades later to reduce a victim to a name in a database. Diane Maxwell Jackson. Case number. Date of death. Cause of death. Suspect. Sentence. But those words conceal an entire life. Diane had hopes, responsibilities, people who depended on her, a future that had not yet happened. The murder did not simply end a life. It created decades of consequences for everyone who survived her. Her family had to live with uncertainty. They had to wonder whether the killer might ever be found. They had to wonder whether someone in their community knew more than they had admitted. They had to live with the knowledge that the person responsible was somewhere outside the prison system. That uncertainty can become its own form of suffering. There is no date on which an unsolved murder stops hurting. There is no anniversary when a family suddenly wakes up and decides that the unanswered question no longer matters. The question remains: who did it? Why did it happen? Could it have been prevented? Was the killer ever close to the family? Did he ever pass them on the street? Did he ever hear Diane's name spoken? Did he ever believe investigators had forgotten? For 34 years, those questions had no answer. Then a fingerprint changed one of them. Who? James Ray Davis. That single answer carried enormous weight. But it also raised another disturbing thought. How close had the investigation come in 1969? Was the evidence always pointing toward the same man? Could the case have been solved earlier if the technology had existed? There is no way to know exactly what might have happened under different circumstances. Cold cases are filled with alternate histories. A witness who might have remembered more. A database that did not yet exist. A forensic test that had not yet been developed. A piece of evidence stored for years before anyone realized its potential. Diane's case belonged to that world. The investigation became a reminder that evidence can outlive the methods used to collect it. The officers who originally handled the case could not search the fingerprint the way investigators could in 2003. They did what they could with the tools available. Then decades later, another generation of investigators picked up the trail. That continuity mattered. The case did not solve itself. Someone had to reopen it. Someone had to believe the old evidence was worth examining. Someone had to send the fingerprint into the database. Someone had to examine the result. Someone had to locate Davis. Someone had to confront him. And someone had to take the case through the legal system. That chain of decisions transformed a forgotten homicide into a solved murder. It also demonstrated why cold cases sometimes remain alive, even when the public stops hearing about them. A case file can become quiet without becoming dead. Evidence can remain preserved. Names can remain recorded. Fingerprints can remain unchanged. And technology can create possibilities that investigators decades earlier could not imagine. In Diane's case, the technology arrived before the evidence disappeared. That timing changed everything. Imagine the fingerprint sitting in storage through the 1970s. Then the 1980s. Then the 1990s. Years passing. New police officers joining departments. Old investigators retiring. New cases replacing old ones. But inside that evidence was the same pattern. The same ridges. The same identity. Waiting. The fingerprint did not become stronger with age. It became more useful because the world around it changed. That distinction is crucial. Evidence does not always need to evolve. Sometimes the technology around it evolves instead. And when the two finally meet, a case that seemed impossible can suddenly move at extraordinary speed. That is what happened in 2003. Within hours, a 34-year-old mystery had a potential suspect. Then investigators verified the lead. Then they found Davis. Then came the confession. And eventually the sentence. Life in prison. The man who had once been unknown was now legally accountable. But even with that outcome, there remained a painful imbalance. Davis received a future. Diane never did. He grew older. She did not. He saw the world change. She remained forever 25. He lived through decades that Diane was denied. That is one of the cruelest realities of murder. The victim is frozen in the moment of death. The offender continues through time. Unless justice intervenes. In this case, it eventually did. 34 years late. but it did. For investigators, the case became an example of what persistence and technology can accomplish. For Diane's family, it meant they could finally stop asking who was responsible. For the public, it became another warning that the smallest trace can survive longer than anyone expects. And for cold case detectives, the lesson was unmistakable. Never assume an old case has nothing left to say. Because somewhere inside an evidence locker may be the answer. A fingerprint. A fiber. A photograph. A document. Something collected decades earlier and forgotten by everyone except the people who knew what it meant. Diane's fingerprint evidence was one of those things. It waded through an entire generation. Then, in a few hours, it spoke. The voice was silent. There was no dramatic revelation. No sudden appearance of a witness. Just a computer screen. A list of candidates. And one name rising above the others. James Ray Davis. That name ended the uncertainty surrounding the identity of Diane's killer. But it also transformed the way her story would be remembered. She was no longer only the victim of an unsolved 1969 homicide. Her case became a story about evidence that refused to disappear. A story about investigators who refused to let the file remain forgotten. A story about technology reaching backward through time. And above all, a story about a young woman whose murder remained important long after the headlines faded. 34 years is a long time. Long enough for people to assume that the truth may never come. Long enough for a killer to believe that the past has become unreachable. But the past does not always stay buried. Sometimes it waits in the smallest place imaginable. On the surface of a car. Inside an old evidence file. In the ridges of a fingerprint. And when the right moment arrives, that tiny trace can become louder than decades of silence. Diane Maxwell Jackson's family waited 34 years for that moment. When it finally came, it did not bring Diane back. Brought something else. An answer. And sometimes, after decades of uncertainty, an answer is the closest thing a family can get to the justice they have been waiting for. The sentence brought the legal process to an end, but the story of Diane Maxwell Jackson did not disappear when the courtroom doors closed. There was no dramatic return to normal. There never could be. A murder committed in 1969 had already altered the lives of everyone connected to Diane. The conviction could establish accountability, but it could not reconstruct the future that had been taken from her. And perhaps that is why the most haunting part of the case is not the moment James Ray Davis was identified. It is the 34 years before it happened. 34 years during which the evidence existed without an answer. 34 years during which Diane's family had to live with a question that could not be resolved. 34 years during which the person responsible remained outside prison. The calendar kept moving. The case did not. For Diane's loved ones, anniversaries must have carried a particular kind of silence. Another year. Another December. Another reminder that Diane had not grown older. She had remained 25 in their memories while everyone around her continued aging. Photographs became more precious. Memories became more distant. And the unanswered question remained the same. Who had done this? That question was eventually answered by something Diane's killer had apparently never considered important. His own fingerprint. There is something almost unsettlingly ordinary about fingerprints. People leave them everywhere. On doors. Windows. Tables. Cars. Telephone receivers. Most disappear without anyone noticing. But in a murder investigation, a fingerprint can become something else. It becomes a connection. A physical bridge between a person and a place. In Diane's case, that bridge crossed more than 3 decades. The print had been recovered during an investigation in an era when forensic science was already valuable, but far less powerful than it would become. Investigators understood fingerprints. They understood their individuality. What they did not have was the enormous digital infrastructure that would eventually allow a latent print to be compared rapidly against millions of records. That difference changed the fate of the case. The fingerprint did not become more accurate in 2003. It was the same fingerprint. The difference was that investigators finally possessed the ability to ask a much larger question. Who in the available records has these ridges? The search returned 20 potential candidates. The first name was James Ray Davis. For a cold case investigator, that moment must have been extraordinary. An evidence item that had been silent for decades had suddenly produced a lead. But there was no guarantee the lead would survive scrutiny. That is the discipline of forensic investigation. A computer result is not a conviction. A candidate is not a killer. A database match is the beginning of an investigation, not the end. Investigators had to verify what the technology had produced. They had to examine Davis's background. They had to reconstruct his timeline. They had to determine whether the physical evidence and the circumstances of the crime were compatible with his involvement. Then came the confrontation. Davis could have denied everything. He could have claimed he had never touched Diane's vehicle. He could have questioned the fingerprint. He could have offered another explanation. Instead, according to investigators, he confessed. That confession was significant because it gave investigators another layer of evidence to compare against the physical trail. The case now contained a remarkable sequence. Evidence from 1969. A modern fingerprint search in 2003. A suspect identified by the system. A criminal history. A timeline that placed Davis in a troubling position. And a confession. The investigation had crossed from uncertainty into accountability. But the story of Diane was still the center of everything. It is easy for a cold case to become a puzzle. Investigators look for pieces. Databases look for matches. Forensic technicians look for patterns. Prosecutors look for proof. But behind every piece is a human being. Diane was not a fingerprint. She was not a case number. She was not a crime scene photograph. She was a young woman with a family and a life that should have continued. The violence that ended her life became the defining event in the lives of people who loved her. That is the hidden cost of an unsolved murder. The victim is gone. But the unanswered question remains alive. It follows birthdays, funerals, family gatherings, milestones. Every major event can carry the shadow of the person who should have been there. And when the killer is unknown, that shadow has no shape. There is no face to blame. No name. No explanation. Only absence. For Diane's family, the identification of Davis finally gave that absence a face. But it also forced them to confront something else. The person responsible had lived for decades after the murder. He had experienced ordinary days. He had watched seasons change. He had grown older. He had lived in a world where Diane's family knew his name only as an unknown figure. That imbalance is one of the cruelest elements of a long unsolved homicide. The victim's life stops. The suspect's life continues. The clock moves for one and not the other. Until an investigation catches up. In 2003 it finally did. And the technology responsible for the breakthrough became almost as important as the suspect himself. The case demonstrated the power of computerized fingerprint identification, at a time when cold case investigations were increasingly being transformed by forensic databases. Evidence that had once been practically dormant could now be re-examined. Old fingerprints could be digitized. Latent prints could be searched. Records from different jurisdictions could become part of a larger investigative network. A case no longer had to remain trapped inside the limitations of the year in which it occurred. That was the real turning point. The investigation could travel backward. Modern technology could reach into the past. The past could suddenly produce new evidence in the present. For families of homicide victims, that possibility is enormously important. The case may be decades old. The suspect may have changed his appearance. Witnesses may have forgotten details. But fingerprints do not change in the way faces do. The ridge patterns remain. That permanence made the evidence so powerful. The killer could grow older. The fingerprint could not. The killer could move. The fingerprint remained where it had been left. The killer could believe the crime belonged to another era. The fingerprint did not care what year it was. It simply remained evidence. And then, one day, technology found its owner. The story also carries an important warning about time. Time can create the illusion that a crime has disappeared. But time does not necessarily erase evidence. Sometimes it only makes the eventual discovery more dramatic. 34 years can make an investigation appear impossible. Then one search can change everything. For investigators who work cold cases, this is more than a dramatic story. It is a reason to keep looking. Every old evidence box has a question attached to it. What if? What if the evidence was never fully examined? What if the technology has changed? What if the suspect's fingerprints are now in a database? What if someone who was unknown in 1969 became known to law enforcement decades later? What if the answer has been sitting there all along? Diane's case provided an extraordinary answer to those questions. The evidence had been there. The technology eventually caught up. And the suspect was found. There was another important element. Persistence. Cold cases rarely move forward because of one person or one machine. They move because somebody decides the case deserves another look. In Diane's investigation, the willingness to revisit the evidence was critical. Her brother David Maxwell had pursued the case while building his own career in law enforcement. That personal connection gave the investigation a determination that could not easily be separated from the professional work. He knew the victim. He knew the family. He understood the cost of an unanswered homicide. And he knew that the passage of time did not make the murder less important. If anything, it made the need for an answer more urgent. The case became a reminder that victims do not become less deserving of justice simply because their files are old. A murder from yesterday and a murder from 34 years ago are still murders. The difference is the difficulty of finding the answer. In Diane's case, that difficulty was overcome. Not through a spectacular discovery. Not through luck alone. But through the combination of preserved evidence, technological advancement, investigative persistence, and a suspect whose identity had remained hidden in plain sight for decades. The final outcome was life in prison. The legal system had spoken. But the larger emotional question remained. Could justice ever truly compensate for 34 lost years? There is no simple answer. For some families, an arrest brings relief. For others, a conviction brings closure. For others, there is no closure at all. There is only a new reality. The unknown becomes known. The suspect becomes a convicted murderer. The unanswered question becomes a historical fact. But the victim remains gone. Diane remained gone. That is why the case should not be remembered only for the technology that solved it. It should be remembered for the life that existed before the murder. Before the headlines. Before the evidence. Before the courtroom. Before the fingerprint became famous. There was Diane. A 25-year-old woman. A mother. A telephone operator. A person whose future was supposed to continue. Her story was interrupted. But it was not erased. For decades, her name remained attached to an unanswered murder. Then the evidence spoke. Quietly. Almost invisibly. And when it did, it changed everything. The fingerprint became the witness that never forgot. Could not describe the attack. could not explain motive. It could not tell investigators what happened inside those final moments. But it could do one thing with extraordinary precision. It could point toward the person whose hand had touched the vehicle. 34 years later, that was enough to reopen a door that everyone had believed was closed. Behind that door was a name. Behind the name was an investigation. Behind the investigation was a confession. And behind the confession was a courtroom. The sentence came. The case was solved. But the fingerprint remains the image that defines the story. A tiny pattern left behind in 1969. A silent signature. A fragment of evidence that survived every year that passed. And when investigators finally asked it the right question, it answered. Not with a voice. Not with a photograph. Not with a confession. With a name. James Ray Davis. For 34 years, that name had been missing from Diane Maxwell Jackson's story. Then suddenly it was impossible to remove. The case had waited longer than anyone expected. But it had not forgotten. And neither had the evidence. The evidence had not forgotten. That was the uncomfortable truth left behind after the conviction of James Ray Davis. For decades, the case had seemed to belong to another America, a different Houston, a different era of policing, a time when investigators could collect evidence, but could not always unlock its meaning. Then technology reached backward. And the past answered. But behind the forensic breakthrough was a much darker question. What had Diane Maxwell Jackson's final hours actually looked like? The fingerprint could identify a man. Could not recreate the fear. It could not restore the sound of Diane's voice. It could not show the precise moment when an ordinary day became a nightmare. Those details remained trapped in December 1969. What investigators knew was that Diane's murder had been extraordinarily violent. She had been raped, strangled, and stabbed. Her body was discovered after she was taken to an abandoned structure near an old service station. Her car became evidence. And somewhere on that vehicle was the fingerprint that would eventually change the entire case. But for the original investigators, there was no way to know how important that print would become. Imagine the scene in 1969. The investigators arrive. They secure the area. They examine the vehicle. They photograph what they can. They collect physical evidence. They document what they see. Every action is part of an attempt to reconstruct a crime that has already happened. But the killer is gone. The victim cannot speak. The witnesses, if there are any, can provide only fragments. The evidence must speak for them. And sometimes evidence speaks in a language that investigators cannot yet translate. That was Diane's fingerprint. It was there. But its meaning was delayed. Years became decades. The case became cold. The original investigation slowly disappeared from public attention. But the evidence remained part of the record. That distinction matters. A case can disappear from headlines without disappearing from police files. The difference is enormous. When a case is forgotten publicly, people may assume that the investigation ended. In reality, evidence can remain preserved for years, waiting for a new investigator, a new technology, or a new piece of information. Diane's murder was one of those cases. And when the investigation was revived, the fingerprint suddenly became more valuable than it had ever been. The FBI's IAFI system provided investigators with something that had been impossible in 1969. A nationwide computerized search. Instead of comparing one fingerprint card against another by hand, investigators could submit the latent print and allow the system to search an enormous collection of records. The machine produced 20 potential candidates. 20 names. But one stood out. James Ray Davis. The name was only a lead. The investigators still had to determine whether the man behind that name could truly be connected to the murder. That process required patience. A cold case cannot be solved by excitement alone. Every apparent breakthrough must survive examination. Every coincidence must be tested. Every claim must be compared with physical evidence. And Davis's history presented investigators with another important detail. He had recently completed a prison sentence. Only 9 days before Diane was murdered. That timeline did not prove that he had killed her. But it gave detectives a reason to look closely. The fingerprint gave them a reason to look closer. His history gave them another. And then came the confrontation. 34 years after Diane's death, investigators were finally sitting across from the man whose fingerprint had been recovered from her vehicle. The distance between 1969 and 2003 suddenly disappeared. For decades, the killer had existed in the case as an unknown figure. Now there was a human being sitting in front of investigators. A man who could answer questions. A man who could deny the allegations. A man who could explain the fingerprint. A man who could finally tell investigators what had happened. According to the FBI's account, Davis confessed. The confession did something the fingerprint alone could never do. It gave investigators a narrative. The physical evidence had pointed toward a person. The confession connected that person to the crime. The pieces that had been separated by 34 years began to converge. And yet, for Diane's family, the confession could not provide the one thing they wanted most. More time. Nothing could. No evidence. No database. No confession. No sentence. Diane was still gone. That is why cold case investigations are so emotionally complicated. When a suspect is finally arrested, the public often experiences the moment as a conclusion. For the family, it can feel more like another beginning. The beginning of hearings. The beginning of legal proceedings. The beginning of hearing the crime described again. The beginning of seeing the suspect's name connected publicly to the death of someone they loved. Justice brings relief. But justice also forces the family to reopen memories that may have been buried for years. In Diane's case, the passage of time made that confrontation even more striking. The people who had known her in 1969 had spent more than 3 decades living with her absence. Some had built families. Some had moved. Some had aged beyond the age Diane ever reached. Yet the murder remained unchanged. The date remained. The victim remained. The evidence remained. Only the investigation had changed. That is the peculiar nature of cold cases. Time changes everything except the central fact. Someone died. Someone caused it. Someone left evidence. And somewhere the truth remains. The Diane Maxwell Jackson case also reveals how dramatically forensic science has changed the meaning of an evidence locker. In an earlier era, an old fingerprint could be a frustrating artifact. Investigators might know it belonged to someone. But without the right comparison, there was nowhere to go. Modern databases changed that equation. A latent print could become searchable. A search could produce candidates. Candidates could become suspects. Suspects could become investigations. And investigations could become prosecutions. The technology did not replace detectives. It expanded what detectives could ask. That distinction is critical. A computer did not walk into the crime scene in 1969. It did not interview witnesses. It did not preserve the evidence. It did not reopen the case. It simply became available decades later and allowed investigators to examine an old clue in a completely new way. That is why the case became such a powerful example of forensic persistence. The fingerprint had survived. The records had survived. The investigation had survived. And eventually the technology caught up with all three. But there is another side to the story. The passage of 34 years also demonstrates the limitations of memory. Imagine asking someone in 2003 to remember an event from 1969. What was happening? Where were you? Who did you see? What did the person look like? What did they say? Memory can change. Details can fade. Confidence can grow even when accuracy declines. That is why physical evidence can become so important in old investigations. Person may forget. A fingerprint does not. The ridge pattern does not become uncertain. It remains fixed. That permanence gave investigators something they could trust when human recollection had become increasingly fragile. The same principle applies to photographs, documents, and preserved biological evidence. The older a case becomes, the more valuable reliable physical evidence can become. Diane's case contained exactly that kind of evidence. The fingerprint had survived the decades. And when investigators finally had access to a powerful enough database, it produced a path forward. The case then moved rapidly compared with the 34 years that preceded it. The search took hours. The suspect was identified. Investigators followed the lead. Davis was located. He was confronted. He confessed. And eventually he pleaded guilty. Life imprisonment followed. A murder that had remained unresolved since 1969 had finally reached a legal conclusion. But the timeline remained staggering. 34 years to identify the killer. Only a few hours for a computerized search to produce the crucial lead. That contrast says almost everything about the case. The answer was not necessarily impossible. The technology simply had not yet arrived. For families living with cold cases, that is both hopeful and painful. Hopeful because evidence can survive. Painful because the answer may exist for years without anyone being able to access it. Diane's family experienced both realities. They waited. They watched the case remain unresolved. Then they watched technology transform it. The person responsible was finally named. The legal system finally acted. And the case moved from uncertainty to history. But history has a strange way of preserving details. People forget dates. They forget names. They forget newspaper headlines. Yet certain images remain. A deserted structure. A vehicle left behind. A young woman's photograph. A fingerprint lifted from a car. A database search decades later. 20 possible candidates. One name. James Ray Davis. That sequence is what gives the case its almost unbelievable quality. There was no dramatic chase across state lines. No killer caught in the immediate aftermath. No confession recorded in 1969. Instead, there was silence. Then technology. Then a match. Then a confession. And finally a sentence. The case was over. But the fingerprint remained as a reminder that evidence can outlive the people who created it. Diane could not speak. Her killer had remained silent for decades. The witnesses could not provide everything investigators needed. But the physical evidence had never stopped existing. It waited through every year of uncertainty. And when investigators finally knew how to search it, the fingerprint became the voice of a woman who had been unable to tell her own story. That is perhaps the most powerful legacy of the case. Not that a computer found a name. Not that a cold case became a conviction. But that something left behind in the chaos of a brutal crime survived long enough to challenge the passage of time. 34 years could not erase it. A changing city could not erase it. An aging investigation could not erase it. And the man who left it behind could not outrun it forever. Eventually, the smallest trace became the strongest connection. The past had waited. Technology arrived. And the truth followed. The truth had followed, but truth alone does not erase the years that came before it. By the time James Ray Davis stood before the court in 2003, Diane Maxwell Jackson had been dead for more than 3 decades. The investigation that began in 1969 had crossed an entire generation before finally reaching its conclusion. The case had survived changing detectives, changing technology, changing neighborhoods, and changing lives. Yet the central fact remained untouched. Diane had been murdered, and the person responsible had once believed the crime could remain buried forever. That belief was destroyed by a fingerprint. It is easy to imagine the moment as dramatic: a computer screen, a name appearing, investigators realizing they may finally have their man. But the real drama was quieter. It was the realization that an object connected to Diane's final hours had preserved something the killer had not intended to leave behind: his identity. The fingerprint had no voice, but it had a memory. And that memory stretched all the way back to 1969. The evidence was especially powerful because it existed independently of the suspect's later statements. It was not something created after investigators focused on Davis. It had been collected before anyone knew his name. The print had existed when Davis was simply another unidentified person somewhere in the country. That distinction separated suspicion from evidence. Investigators could look at Davis's criminal history. They could examine the timing of his release from prison. They could question him about his connection to Diane. But the fingerprint was different. It was physical. It was preserved. It was tied to the vehicle. And when modern technology compared the pattern against available records, Davis emerged as the leading candidate. The case had suddenly acquired a direction. But the investigators still had to walk that road carefully. Cold cases are dangerous territory for anyone who becomes emotionally attached to a theory. 34 years of uncertainty can create enormous pressure to accept the first plausible answer. Detectives could not afford that. They needed confirmation. They needed consistency. They needed the evidence to point in the same direction. And as the investigation progressed, the pieces continued to converge. Davis had a criminal past. He had been released from prison only 9 days before Diane's murder. His fingerprint was identified on the victim's vehicle. Then investigators confronted him. And he confessed. The confession was the moment when the case's silence finally became words. For years, Diane's family had known only what the original investigation could establish. They knew she had died violently. They knew someone had taken her life. They knew the killer had escaped identification. Now the man investigators believed responsible was telling them what he had done. There is a particular cruelty in hearing a confession decades after a murder. The family has spent years imagining what might have happened. Then reality arrives. Can be worse than imagination. The details become real. The unknown becomes known. And the past suddenly becomes present again. Yet the confession also provided something that the family had been denied for 34 years. Certainty. The name was no longer an unanswered question. James Ray Davis. The man behind the fingerprint. The man who had been released from prison 9 days before the killing. The man who ultimately admitted responsibility. The investigation had crossed a threshold. It was no longer searching for a killer. It was preparing to hold one accountable. And that distinction mattered. For 34 years, the case belonged to the category investigators call cold. But a cold case is never truly cold when evidence remains. The term describes the status of the investigation, not the importance of the victim. Diane did not become less important because years passed. Her family did not stop caring because the evidence had grown old. And the crime did not become less serious because the headlines disappeared. The case simply lacked the connection needed to move forward. That connection came through forensic identification. The FBI's IAFI system represented a new kind of investigative power. It allowed authorities to compare fingerprints against an enormous collection of records far beyond what an investigator in 1969 could realistically search. This was not merely an upgrade in equipment. It was a change in what investigators considered possible. A fingerprint that had once been almost useless as an identification tool could now become the starting point for a national search. And in Diane's case, the search worked. 20 candidates. One leading match. One name. The difference between a mystery and an investigation was suddenly a database result. But there was something else happening beneath the technology. The case was being passed from one generation of investigators to another. The detectives of 1969 could not know what technology in 2003 would make possible. They could only collect and preserve what they believed might matter. That is one of the most important principles in forensic investigation. Evidence does not have to solve the case immediately. Sometimes its purpose is simply to survive until the right question can be asked. Diane's fingerprint survived. That was enough. Decades later, someone asked the question the original investigators could not answer. Whose fingerprint is this? The answer changed the case forever. The story also demonstrates how vulnerable a criminal investigation can be to the limits of its era. Today, fingerprint identification is familiar to the public. Most people understand that fingerprints can be searched electronically. But in 1969, investigators did not have the same digital infrastructure. A fingerprint could be highly useful if police already had a suspect or a corresponding record. Without that connection, the print could remain unidentified. Davis was effectively hidden behind the limitations of the technology. He did not need to destroy the fingerprint. He did not need to remove it. He simply benefited from the fact that investigators could not immediately connect it to him. That advantage lasted for 34 years. Then it vanished. Technology had caught up. The same evidence that had been unable to identify him in 1969 could now point directly toward him in 2003. There is something almost poetic about that reversal. The passage of time, which seemed to protect the killer, eventually became irrelevant. The fingerprint had been waiting longer than the investigation had been active. It had survived every year in which the case appeared impossible. And when the right system became available, the evidence suddenly became decisive. For Diane's family, the identification also changed the meaning of the past. Before 2003, the murder was a permanent question. After 2003, it became a documented event with an identified perpetrator and a legal outcome. The difference may sound technical. It was not. An unresolved murder leaves a family wondering. A solved murder gives them facts. Facts can hurt. But uncertainty can be its own form of torment. For 34 years, the family could not know what happened to the person responsible. Now they could. Davis pleaded guilty to murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. The legal system finally established consequences for a crime that had remained unresolved since 1969. But there was still no way to restore the life Diane should have lived. She never reached 30. She never reached 40. She never reached 50. She never saw the world of 2003. She never saw the technological revolution that ultimately helped solve her murder. She never knew that a fingerprint she left behind in her final days would eventually help identify the man responsible. That is perhaps the most haunting irony of the case. The victim did not live long enough to see justice arrive. But something connected to the crime survived long enough to bring it. The fingerprint became a kind of silent witness. Could not remember the violence. Could not describe the attack. Could not explain motive. But it could establish contact. And sometimes in a cold case, one connection is all investigators need. The rest can be built around it. The case also left a lesson for future investigators. Never underestimate old evidence. Never assume that because a fingerprint failed to produce a match in one decade, it will fail forever. Databases grow. Technology improves. Records become digitized. Methods become more sensitive. A case that appears impossible today may look completely different 10 years from now. That principle has changed the way cold cases are approached across the United States. Evidence lockers are no longer simply places where old cases are stored. They can become archives of future investigations. The technology of tomorrow may be able to read what the technology of today cannot. Diane's murder became an example of that reality. Her case was not solved because investigators suddenly discovered a new crime scene. It was solved because investigators looked at an old crime scene with new tools. The evidence had been waiting. The question had been waiting. The family had been waiting. And eventually, the system was capable of answering. 34 years after Diane's murder, the unknown man became a known man. The name James Ray Davis became attached to the case. The fingerprint became evidence. The confession became part of the investigation. The guilty plea became the legal conclusion. And the life sentence became the punishment. But there was one thing the courtroom could never sentence: the years themselves. 34 years of uncertainty could not be returned. 34 years of Diane's absence could not be repaired. 34 years of questions could not be erased by a single verdict. Justice had arrived, but time remained lost. That is why the case continues to resonate. It is not simply a story about a murderer who was eventually caught. It is a story about a family that refused to let a victim disappear into an old file. It is a story about evidence that survived longer than anyone expected. It is a story about technology reaching backward through time. And it is a story about the terrifying possibility that a killer can believe he has escaped forever, only to discover decades later that one careless touch was enough to keep the door open. Davis had left the scene. He had lived for decades. He had moved beyond the immediate investigation. But the fingerprint remained behind. The hand was gone. The mark remained. And when investigators finally had the ability to read it, the past came rushing forward. The cold case was no longer cold. The name was known. The killer was identified. The courtroom had spoken. And somewhere inside the history of the case, that tiny fingerprint remained the most enduring symbol of all. Because the killer had forgotten the moment. The evidence had not. What James Ray Davis could not escape was not a witness who remembered his face, not a detective who had followed him for decades, and not some dramatic piece of evidence discovered beneath the floorboards. It was something much smaller. Something he had probably forgotten almost immediately. The touch of a hand against a vehicle. That ordinary act became extraordinary because the hand belonged to a man whose identity investigators would not discover for another 34 years. By 2003, the fingerprint had become more than evidence from an old homicide. It had become a timeline. A connection between two worlds. One world belonged to Diane Maxwell Jackson, a 25-year-old woman whose life ended in 1969. The other belonged to the investigation that finally identified the person responsible in 2003. Between those 2 points was an entire generation of silence. But silence can be deceptive. A case may sound silent because nothing is happening publicly. Behind the scenes, evidence can still exist. Records can still exist. Names can still exist. And sometimes the most important clue is waiting in a place nobody has looked at with modern eyes. That was the power of Diane's case. The original investigators had preserved what they could. Decades later, another generation had the tools to search it. The result was a connection that would have been almost impossible to make in 1969. James Ray Davis. Once investigators had his name, the mystery began to collapse. But the collapse did not happen all at once. It happened through verification. One detail after another. The fingerprint. The database search. The criminal history. The timing of Davis's release from prison. The location. The questioning. The confession. Each piece added weight to the same conclusion. And that is how a cold case is often solved. Not through one spectacular revelation, but through a series of smaller facts that eventually become impossible to separate. The public may remember the moment a suspect is arrested. Investigators remember everything that came before it. The hours spent reviewing old reports. The examination of evidence. The effort to establish whether a fingerprint match was meaningful. The work required to locate a suspect after 3 decades. The questions asked in an interrogation room. The legal preparation that follows. None of that appears in a single dramatic headline. But without it, the headline never happens. For Diane's case, the headline was delayed by 34 years. That delay makes the case especially significant. In 1969, the investigation had to operate within the limits of the era. In 2003, investigators could approach the evidence differently. The FBI's IAFI system had transformed fingerprint searches. Instead of relying solely on local records, investigators could search a much broader collection. That difference gave an old fingerprint new life. The system produced 20 potential candidates. 20 possibilities. One leading candidate. James Ray Davis. The name was not the end. It was the beginning of the final investigation. And the investigators who followed that lead had to confront a difficult reality. They were investigating a crime older than many of the people involved in the modern case. Diane had been dead for more than 3 decades. The original scene was history. The neighborhood had changed. The people connected to the case had aged. The suspect himself had lived another life. Yet the physical evidence had remained. That contrast is what makes the case so unsettling. People change. Evidence can remain fixed. A face becomes older. A memory becomes less precise. A neighborhood disappears. But the ridges on a fingerprint remain the same. That permanence is why fingerprints have such power in forensic investigations. They are not memories. They are physical characteristics. They do not depend on someone remembering what happened. They do not become confused by the passage of time. They simply establish a connection between a person and a surface. In Diane's case, that connection reached backward more than 3 decades. And then came the confession. According to investigators, Davis admitted responsibility. The man who had been unidentified since 1969 was no longer silent. For Diane's family, the confession must have carried an unbearable mixture of emotions. There was finally an answer. But the answer came with the reality of what had been done. The mystery had been painful. The truth was painful too. Yet there is a difference between uncertainty and certainty. For 34 years, Diane's family had been forced to imagine the person responsible. Now they no longer had to imagine. They knew his name. They knew the legal system had him in custody. And they knew the case would no longer remain permanently unresolved. That transformation is difficult to measure. A cold case can become part of a family's identity. The unanswered murder becomes something that is carried from one decade into another. The victim's name remains alive because the case is unfinished. Family members may continue to ask investigators for updates. They may revisit old newspaper stories. They may preserve photographs. They may wonder whether a new technology will eventually make a difference. Diane's case demonstrated that sometimes it does. The fingerprint did not become more valuable because someone discovered it in 2003. It became more valuable because investigators could finally search it properly. That distinction carries an important lesson. Old evidence is not necessarily obsolete evidence. A clue that fails today may succeed tomorrow. A database may expand. A record may be added. A technique may improve. A suspect may eventually enter a system that did not contain his information decades earlier. Time can change the investigative landscape. And sometimes that change is enough to bring a killer into focus. The Davis case also highlights another difficult reality. A criminal can spend decades believing that a crime belongs to the past. But investigators do not measure time the same way. For investigators, a murder remains a murder. The date may be 1969. The evidence may be old. The suspect may be older. But the responsibility does not expire simply because the calendar moves forward. That principle mattered deeply in Diane's case. The murder was not allowed to become irrelevant. The evidence was not discarded simply because it was old. The case was revisited. And once the fingerprint produced a viable lead, investigators followed it. The result was extraordinary. A case that had remained unresolved for more than 3 decades moved toward a legal conclusion. On November 24, 2003, Davis pleaded guilty to murder. He received a life sentence. The sentence was the final legal consequence of a crime that had haunted the Maxwell family since 1969. But even then, the story did not become simple. There is no simple ending to a murder. A guilty plea does not create the life that was lost. A life sentence does not give a family back 34 years. A solved case does not make the victim less dead. It only changes the unanswered questions into established facts. That may be the most difficult truth about justice. Justice can identify responsibility, can impose punishment, can establish a record. But it cannot reverse time. Diane would never know that her killer had finally been identified. She would never see the courtroom. She would never hear the sentence. She would never see the technology that helped solve the case. She remained forever 25. The world moved forward without her. And yet, decades later, the investigation reached back and restored something that had been missing from the historical record. Her killer's identity. That mattered. It mattered to her family. It mattered to the investigators. And it mattered because an unsolved homicide leaves behind a permanent question. Who did this? In Diane's case, the answer eventually became part of the public record. James Ray Davis. A name attached to a fingerprint. A fingerprint attached to a vehicle. A vehicle attached to a murder. A murder attached to a woman whose life ended far too soon. The chain was complete. But perhaps the most disturbing element is how fragile the entire chain once appeared. Remove the fingerprint, and the investigation may have remained without a suspect. Remove the preserved evidence, and the modern search would have had nothing to examine. Remove the later technology, and the fingerprint might still have remained unidentified. Remove the investigator willing to revisit the case, and the technology might never have been applied. The solution required all of these elements to meet. That is why cold case investigations can take decades. Sometimes the evidence exists. Sometimes the technology exists. Sometimes the suspect exists. But they do not meet at the same moment. Diane's case required time to bring them together. And when they finally converged, the result was devastatingly simple. A fingerprint identified a man. A man confessed. A court sentenced him. 34 years of uncertainty ended. But the case left behind a question larger than the identity of the killer. How many other fingerprints are still waiting? How many old evidence files contain clues that modern technology has never examined? How many families are still waiting for a name? Those questions are part of the legacy of every cold case solved through forensic advances. The investigation does not merely close one file. It demonstrates what may still be possible in others. Diane's murder became a reminder that evidence can have a longer life than an investigation. The detectives of 1969 could not know what investigators in 2003 would be able to do. But they preserved something. And that something survived. That is what matters. Because the most powerful clue in the case was not discovered decades later. It was already there. The world simply had to catch up with it. A fingerprint. A silent mark.
A permanent pattern.
34 years of waiting. Then 5 hours of searching. And suddenly the darkness had a name. The killer had believed the years were moving in his favor. But the years were also carrying his evidence forward. Every year brought the investigation closer to technology capable of reading what he had left behind. The clock was not only counting away from the crime. It was counting toward the moment the fingerprint would finally speak. And when that moment arrived, the case that had seemed destined to remain unresolved became something else. A solved murder. A conviction. A life sentence. And a permanent reminder that sometimes the smallest mistake is the one a killer can never outrun. Diane's final story was not erased by 34 years of silence. It was waiting inside the evidence. And eventually the evidence spoke.